that there are three things that are common to all human societies across time and space: common code, religion, and etymology. Because everyone gets common code, all societies have some form of religion, and some form of etymology is found in nearly all societies. Now, I understand here etymology in a very, very broad sense. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to provide a working definition for how I understand etymology in this talk. And then I'm going to give a few examples. So, for the purposes of this talk, I understand etymology as the association of words regarded to be phonetically and semantically congruous. Now, three examples follows. Our first example is taken from Taiwanese Netflix series, Unmarried But. Now here, you can see there is the protagonist of the series called Ying, and she's suggesting, while she's chatting with a friend on the phone, that spouse does not mean companion, but rather snare. And these words, because both words in Chinese, they actually sound the same, ban. Now we could perhaps say in English that a spouse does not bring about bonding, but bondage, understanding the latter term as a state of being bound, not of course in a sexual meaning. The second example I'm going to give, it's from a crucial passage in Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus addresses his disciple, Simon Peter, saying, "Thou," can you see him statement? "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock," Petra in ancient Greek, "I will build my church." Now, this statement works, of course, because Peter and rock in ancient Greek sound similar. Our third and last example is taken from an English-speaking child who, during World War I, was 5 years and 9 months old when he or she said, "Mother, there must be two sorts of anemones, flowers and Germans." Now, the point I'm making here is that etymology, understood in a very broad sense, which I gave above, is a nearly universal phenomenon. Now, it has been appropriately said that man, understand human beings, is an etymologizing animal, and that most of us share an etymological instinct. Now, what I would like with you today is to look and explore a specific historically situated tradition of etymology, what we will call the South Asian tradition of etymology. And I will try to show that this tradition played an important role in the intellectual and religious histories of South Asia, as well as in those cultures that were influenced by South Asia. And I will try to make this point by looking at three examples or vignettes. First, we will explore etymology's role in ancient India. Second, in Buddhism in the Pali and Chinese tradition. And third, we will look at two examples in 19th century India and Europe. Now, my big proposal really is as follows. I hope to show that the South Asian tradition of etymology underlies some key moments in the intellectual and religious history of a non-negligible chunk of humanities. Now, let's begin with our first vignette, ancient India. Now, we are around 800 before Common Era, somewhere in what is today northern India, and as well as a part of Pakistan, perhaps. Now, there are a group of people who call themselves Aryans, which means the noble ones, and they had been trickling into India from the Himalaya passes. They speak an ancient form of Sanskrit, an Indo-European language related to English, and it is in their ancient text, called the Vedas, which means wisdom, that we find the beginning of the South Asian tradition of etymology. Interestingly, our story begins not with humans, but with gods. Because we are told in this text that there are two kinds of words. On the one hand, we have the ordinary words that are spoken by human beings. On the other hand, there are words that are spoken and known only to gods. And there is a crucial difference between these two kinds of words. That is, the words spoken by human beings are what we might say etymologically opaque. It's not clear where they come from. On the other hand, the words spoken by the gods are etymologically transparent. Now, let's try to understand this point by looking at two examples. And these are the names of two of the most powerful ancient Indian gods. We have the name of the god Indra, a warrior god of weather, and the name of the god of fire, Agni, down on the slide. Now, Indra and Agni are the ordinary words, and these words are opaque. It's not clear really. I mean, for the Indians, it's not clear where they come from. These ancient texts tell us that the gods' original names were not Indra and Agni, but rather Indha and Agri. And these two names are etymologically transparent. That is, Indra comes from a root ind, which means to kindle. So Indra is the one that kindles, the kindler. And we are told in this text that the god is so called because he kindled from within other gods by means of his power. Similarly, we are told that the ancient prototypical transparent name of Agni was Agri. Agri itself means first or foremost. And we are told that that's the name of the god because the god is the first entity to have emerged from this cosmogonic egg from which all the universe originated. Now the question is, how is it that we have these two kinds of names, that is the etymologically transparent ones known to gods, and the opaque ones, which are the ordinary names spoken by human beings? How's that? We are told in this text that that's because of the gods. So the gods are those that manipulated language. And as a result of this manipulation, the opaque names emerged. So gods are those who got the originally etymologically clear Indha, kindler, and Agri foremost, and transformed them into the unclear or opaque Indra, Agni. Now another question really is, why did they do that? Why did the gods do that? So there are basically two reasons. Now the first reason is that ancient Indian gods, they love what is mysterious and opaque, which interestingly is the opposite of their light, short nature. There is a refrain in this text that says, "For gods love the cryptic and hate the evident," and that's why they acted. Another reason is that the gods are afraid that human beings, by knowing the originally transparent name of the gods, might somehow gain control over them. This is, of course, based on the ideas that names are not just labels, but are powerful entities. Now, you can easily realize that out of this situation, etymology emerges, okay? But etymology, here, when it originates, it has to do quite a lot with what we would say to be magic, really. Because etymology is a sort of man-made technique, the purpose of which is to try to retrieve the original transparent name that embodies the original powers. However, the point I'm trying to make is that even though originally it had to do with magic, okay, very early on, etymology also became a very widespread tool for thinking, which was used by different thinkers in ancient India to develop different kinds of ideas. We'll look at one example, which is here on the right-hand side, and that's the Upanishadic thinker Uddalaka Arvi. And the Upanishads being, of course, what are generally considered to be the seminal works of philosophy in ancient India. Now, Uddalaka is one of the most famous philosophers, if you want to use that word. And in one text, he proposes what has been called a turning point in the history of Indian philosophy, that is a materialistic view. So he maintains that everything in the universe can be analyzed in terms of three basic components, which are heat, water, and food. So no matter what you pick up for analysis, everything can be analyzed according to these three basic components. For us, it's interesting that at a certain point, Uddalaka discusses sleep, hunger, and thirst. And he wants to demonstrate, according to his view, that these three things can be analyzed as consisting of these three elements. Now, interesting for us, he makes his point by means of an etymological analysis of the word themselves. That is, he picks up the word and he analyzes it, and by doing so he says, look, this is actually show us that what is at work here of these three basic components. Let's briefly consider the example that he gives. The word Uddanya, which is a very strange word that he might have made up for the purposes of etymology up to a certain extent. Now, he says, Uddanya, which seems to mean thirst, it actually refers to heat, he says, heat being one of the three universal components. How does he get to that point? By means of an etymological analysis. He says, Uddanya should be understood as consisting of two words, Uda, which he says means water, and driver, Nya, which he relates to a root meaning to drive. So the water driver actually turns out to be heat. The basic idea behind that is not too difficult to understand. Think about you going for a run. Right? Your body heats up, as a result of that you sweat, and therefore the heat can be seen as the originator of your thirst, something like that. But what is important for us, though, is to emphasize again the role that etymology plays here. Etymology is resorted to or used by Uddalaka Agni to foreground and further develop his innovative ideas that everything can be understood as the intermingling of these three basic factors. Now, we move on to a third aspect of etymology in ancient India. That is, etymology developed into a fully fledged linguistic science. And this is embodied in a text which is called Nirukta, or etymology, and whose author is a certain Yaska. Now, this text was composed around 3rd century before Common Era. And in this text, we actually find sophisticated reflections about linguistics as well as about philosophy of language. And we're going to look at one example, which I hope is going to be interesting. And this is a controversy recorded in the Nirukta between Yaska on the left, that is the author of the Nirukta, and a certain Gargya on the right. And the key issue which is being debated is what words can be explained etymologically. Now we'll look at that in some detail, so please try to bear with me. So, Yaska. Now, for Yaska, all words can be analyzed etymologically, doesn't matter what. On the other hand, Gargya maintains that only certain words can be analyzed etymologically. And he says, words that can thus be analyzed must exhibit two properties, a morphological and a semantic properties. Now, morphologically, they have to be transparent. By that, he means, look at the word and you can immediately relate it to a certain verbal root. Semantically, these words, they have to be general as opposed to specific words. That is, they refer to an action as opposed to referring to an object. Now, to try to understand what Gargya means with these two properties that I just summarized, let's try to provide two examples using English. And let's look at the word traverser and horse, okay? Now, according to Gargya, of these two words, only traverser can be explained etymologically. Because traverser is morphologically clear. Clearly, it derives from the root to traverse, from the verb to traverse. Similarly, traverser, Gargya maintains, it's also a general name. Why is that? Because traversing can apply to any object that performs the action of traversing. It doesn't matter that object be a man, a child, a horse, any object that performs the traversal of a road can be called traversal, and therefore can be derived, according to Gardia. Okay? Now, it gets more interesting, perhaps. So, Gardia has this assumption that all words that are derivable must present these two properties that we just delineated a bit. So, on the basis of this assumption, Gardia raises two interconnected objections against Yaska's view that all words, without exception, can be derived. So, Gardia says, all right, now let's assume with you, Yaska, that all words are derivable. That can't be the case, because from this assumption, two possible consequences that are contradicted by actual linguistic usage would follow. Let's first summarize them, and I will provide some examples to clarify that. Now, the first consequence is that all words would refer to a general as opposed to a specific object. That is, all words would behave like traversal, not like horse. And the second related point is that no object would have its specific name, but any object would receive as many names as the action with which it is associated. All right, now let's try to understand what Gardias mean by that. And let's try to understand that by looking at the word horse, okay? Now, for Gardia, horse cannot be derived because it doesn't present these two properties. Morphologically, it isn't clear where horse comes from, and semantically, horse refers to a specific object, is a horse. Now, Gardia says, if we assume with you, Yaska, that horse were derivable as well, then suppose that horse derived from a verb to horse about. So, horse would then mean someone who horses around. And if that was the case, then horse could refer to any object that performs the action of horsing around. Not only to horse, but to a child, or to a man, or to any kind of animals. And similarly, the problem would be that then there would be no names, basically, but every single linguistic label referring to an object would not refer to that specific object, but to the action which the object performs in that particular context. So a horse would not be called horse. A horse would be called, well, it would be called horse when the horse horses around. But when the horse drinks, it would be called drinker. When the horse runs, it would be called runner, or something like that. So these are the two consequences that Gardia says, if we agree with your view, then we end up with this problem. That's not how things are in language. Now, interestingly, Yaska countered this objection on the same ground as Gardia. Because Gardia uses the reference to the actual linguistic usage to say, your idea is wrong. So does Yaska. So Yaska says, well, you know what? You assume that all words that are derivable, they have to present these two properties, morphologically transparent and general, as opposed to specific names. However, in language, we do find names which are morphologically transparent, yet they refer to specific, not general object. Now, an example is perhaps the English word blackbird. Now, blackbird, if you look at that, you immediately notice where it comes from. So it's made of two words, black and bird. So it is, let's say it is analyzable etymologically. However, blackbird does not refer to any bird that happens to be black, but refers specifically to a kind of bird. All right? Okay, that was quite a lot to take in, but I hope it was kind of generally clear. And the main point of referring to this controversy, there are several others, is to show the kind of ideas that have to do with linguistics, but as well as to the philosophy of language that we find in ancient India, embodied in particular in this text called Nirutta, or etymology. So let's take stock of what we've seen so far. So in our first vignette, we talk about etymology in ancient India. And first, we saw how etymology originated as a sort of man-made attempt to reverse engineer God's linguistic manipulation of language and thereby retrieve the originally prototypical names that were obscured by the gods. Then we saw, so let's say etymology and magic as a catchword. Then we saw that etymology was used by Upanishadic thinkers, Uddalaka Aruni, to articulate, to advance his ideas that everything can be analyzed in terms of these three basic components. Let's say etymology and philosophy. Etymology is truthful thinking. Then the third example that we look at is Yaska's Nirupta, where etymology is used in the context of advancing ideas that have to do with what we might refer to as linguistics and philosophy of language. All right. So that was our first vignette. Now we leave the Brahmanical or Hindu tradition of ancient India and explore the role that etymology played in Buddhism. And we're going to look at two contexts briefly. Now the first is the Pali Theravada Buddhism. That is, Pali being the ancient language, Middle Indian language, similar in part to Sanskrit, which is the sacred language of the Theravada tradition of Buddhism, which is the tradition practiced in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And then we're going to look at etymology in the context of Chinese Buddhism. So let's begin with the Pali Theravada tradition of Buddhism. Now, we're going to consider the Sermon of the Origins, or Aganya Sutta, which is an ancient foundational text in Pali. Now, in this text, the Buddha employs etymology to attack and subvert the Brahmanical ideology. So the sermon, this text, opens with two Brahmin converts, these two Brahmin who became Buddhists, who approach the Buddha and complain that their former fellow Brahmins abused them for having left the Brahmanical group and become Buddhist. And in their abuse, these Brahmin, they refer to a myth according to which the Brahmins are the best among human beings because they originated from the mouth of the god Brahma. Therefore, also the similarity between the word Brahmana and the god Brahma. Now the Buddha very scathingly replies that that's BS. He says, Brahmin definitely are not born from the god's mouth, but he says, but from female Brahmins' vaginas. As Brahmin women are seen to menstruate, become pregnant, give birth, and lactate. And the Buddha, after that, he argues that the Brahmins came up with this myth that they are born from the mouth of the god Brahman, because truly they have forgotten about the story of the origin. And therefore the Buddha sets out to provide a story of the origins. And in so doing, the Buddha uses etymology to subvert the Brahmanical view. Specifically, he uses etymology to reveal that current meanings of words used by Brahmin themselves are wrong. If understood etymologically, it turns out that the current meaning of these words as perverted meaning of the original meaning. And the original meaning actually turns out to be fully in agreement with contemporary Buddhist values. So basically it says, use this word, use them wrongly. Why? Well, I'll tell you why, by means of etymology. We do an etymological analysis of this word. It turns out that they reflect a Buddhist meaning. So let's just give one example. So the Brahmins, they proudly call themselves by using certain names. Now, one of the names, we just saw it, it's Brahmana, which means something like perhaps offspring of the god Brahman. The other word that they use, and that's Pali language, it's Ajayaka, which means something like students of the Vedas. Because Brahmins are those who control, preserve, transmit, and interpret the Vedas, the crucial text that we use. Now, the Buddha says that the way in which the Brahmin use these terms to call themselves, it's actually a perversion of the word's original meaning. And he argues, for example, what does it say about the word Brahman? Now, at this time, we have to think that even though the word Brahman is written with that R, Brahmana, right? It was probably pronounced like Bahmana. So that's why the etymology works. So the Buddha says, Brahmana at its origin does not mean offspring of God, Brahman, but it is related with Baha, which means to keep away, and it originally designated the group of people who kept away from bad things. And this group of people turns out to be the ancestors of today's Buddhists, according to the Buddha. Similarly, he says, Ajayaka does not mean student of the Veda, but cleverly he takes the word and breaks it into two chunks. A, which is a negation, which means no, and meditators, Jayaka, and he says, these words originally refer to the people who could not put up with the strain of meditation that this group of selected beings were performing. So they quit because it was too much for them. They went back to the village, and after that they started making up text to make a living out of that. So, the subtext is clear. It means that these are people who are not good enough, went back to the village, and they produced the Vedas to earn a living out of that. And these are, of course, the ancestor of the Brahmins. Okay, so in short, etymology is how the Buddha reveals that the Brahmin values as embedded in the names which Brahmin probably use to refer to themselves are in truth a perversion of the name's original meanings. So the words, when understood etymologically, they reveal their original meaning. And this meaning is in full agreement with Buddhistic values. Okay, so now we look at Pali Buddhism, and now we're going to look at. Now, we leave South Asia continent altogether and follow the spread of Buddhism, crossing over the Himalayan peaks and traversing the arid distances of Central Asia. We finally reach China. And Buddhism, through spreading through Central Asia into China, brought with itself this South Asian etymological tradition. And this tradition impacted Chinese Buddhism in interesting and fascinating ways. And we will consider, in particular, how this tradition of etymology migrating to China contributed to shaping the Chinese Buddhist lexicon. Now, in general, suppose you have to translate one word from one source language into a target language. Now, to do so, I suppose you first have to determine, however vaguely, however implicitly, the meaning and form of the word that you want to translate. Now, for example, let's suppose you want to translate the English word skyscraper into another language. Now, one way of doing it would be first to kind of realize that skyscraper can be split into two words, sky and scraper, and then you can translate that, for example, into Italian as grattacielo, where gratta corresponds roughly to scraper and cielo to sky. Now, the South Asian tradition of etymology provided Buddhist translators and interpreters with the philological tools by means of which they determined the meaning and form of many Indian words that they then translated into Chinese. Now, we'll consider just one example, the word asura. Now, asura in Indian text refers to a class of gods, anti-gods, that vie for power with the gods. And according to Buddhism, asura is also one of the realms in which he can be reborn together with the realm of animal, hungry ghosts, and so on. Now the question is, how do you translate this word into Chinese? How do you translate asura into Chinese? Now, one way of doing it is to translate the word according to how the South Asian tradition of etymology tells you you should translate that. And interestingly, there are different ways in India, in this tradition, in which this word was understood. And these different ways are reflected in different translation of interpretation of Chinese. So let's look at three examples. The first example, you get the word asura, and your understanding as consisting of negation A followed by sura, God. And that's reflected in a common translation, Feikian, which is just negation followed by the word for God, roughly, sky. This is one way. Another very fascinating way that you do sometimes find is the second one, Now, here the word asura is understood as being connected with asura. A, again, is a negation, and sura, it's alcohol. And this is connected with a story that explains the origin of these gods. Now, roughly the story goes as follows. Once upon a time, the asura used to be the main gods, standing on the top of Mount Meru. Now, it happened that once new god arrives, and the asura, they had a big party to celebrate them, and they got drunk, and the new arrived god, while they were drunk in his sleep, they kicked them off Mount Meru. And the asura, after they regained consciousness, they said, "Oh God, we're not going to drink anymore. It's because of alcohol that we lost our primacy." And therefore, that's why they're called asura, not alcohol. Okay? And we find these also in the 10th century, where a book is negation, or it's alcohol, and it's nominalized. Third way in which the word asura is interpreted in Indian text, according to this etymological tradition, is as consisting of three parts: a, su, ra. A, again, negation. Su, it means good. So a, su, it means not good, which is sometimes interpreted as the opposite of good, that is evil. And ra, it's taken to derive from ram, a root, which means to delight. So the asura are, whereas the gods delight in what is good, the asura, they delight in what is not good, in what is bad. That's why in some Chinese explanation, during the Tang-dynasty, we find the fei shan xi. So where fei means like negation, shan means like good, and xi means something like delight. Okay, so in short, Chinese translation as well as associated interpretation of the word asura reflect these etymological analysis of the Indian word. Now, the important point here is this, that is that the Chinese translations are not based directly on the word asura itself, but rather they are based on what the Indian etymological translation tells you about that word. So it is as if the South Asian tradition of etymology is like an interface that tells you, oh, this is how you have to understand the word. And therefore the translation is based on what they tell you to do. So the tradition of etymology functions as a kind of cross-linguistic interface that predetermines how a non-negligible number of Indian words are understood and translated as Buddhism spread across Asia into China. All right, so far we've been briefly look at the role that etymology played in ancient India. That's our first vignette. Our second vignette was about the role that etymology had in Buddhism, Pali Theravada Buddhism as well as Chinese Buddhism. Now we move on to our third and final vignette. And we're going to look at the role that the South Asian tradition of etymology played in 19th century India and Europe. And specifically, we're going to look at how this tradition contributed to shaping the ideas, some of the most characteristic ideas, of two very highly influential 19th century authors and thinkers. On the left, we have Friedrich Max Müller. On the right, we have Dayananda Saraswati. Max Müller, a German-born Oxford professor, he was a Victorian academic rock star in terms of academia. And he's also regarded as the founding father of the modern academic study of religion. Dayananda Saraswati was a scholar and religious reformer, the founder of the Arya Samaj, which is a religious and educational movement still very powerful in India, which has millions of followers. Now, on the face of it, these two men, they have little in common. They never met, however, they harshly criticized each other's works on the Vedas being this ancient, most sacred Hindu text. Now, Dayananda, he claims that Müller's work on the Veda has no value because Müller is basically ignorant. He just knows a little bit of Sanskrit, but that's not enough. For his part, Müller criticizes Dayananda's ideas about the Vedas saying that they are hopelessly wrong, basically because Dayananda has no English, and therefore he cannot read up on the most recent work done about comparative religions. That is really the work that Müller himself did. So despite these differences, however, it can be shown that some of the key ideas that these two men had stem from a common influence. And that common influence is precisely this etymological tradition of etymology. Now, let's begin with Dayananda. Now, Dayananda believes that the Vedas are history-transcending sacred texts that profess the purest form of monotheism. He also believes that all knowledge is present in the Veda, including modern technical knowledge at that time, like electricity as well as telegraph, are all in the Vedas, these 3,500 years old. Now, the obvious challenge that he faces is, of course, how can you get this ancient Sanskrit text to yield such interpretation? And this is how etymology comes in handy. Dayananda argues that the words in the Vedas, they should not be understood as having their ordinary meaning that they have in ordinary Sanskrit, but as conveying their etymological meaning, which is attained at by means of an etymological analysis. Let's just look at the idea that the Vedas are about monotheism, that is, that the Vedas profess the faith in the Supreme Lord. Now, how can you do that? If you just open the Vedas, it's filled with names of gods. For example, earlier on in the talk, we mentioned the name Indra and Agni. Now, the way in which it does so, it's by interpreting this word etymologically. Agni does not have the meaning that it has in ordinary language, fire or the god of fire. Rather, it should be understood in relation with certain root, like anch or ag, that mean to know, attain, or worship. And therefore, what it really means when you find it in the Veda, it means one whose nature is knowledge, omniscient, fit to be known, attained, and worshipped. So, basically, the word Agni in the Veda does not designate a specific deity, rather becomes an epithet that it's applicable to the one supreme deity. And this is how I explain all the name of the Vedic gods that we find out by means of this etymological explanation. Now, these might remind you, perhaps, of the Yaska and Gargya controversy that we talked about a while ago. So basically, what Dayananda does here is to explain the name of the Vedic gods in a way that's consistent with the ideas articulated in that controversy. So Agni, Indra, and all these names of gods are not specific object-denoting names that refer to many individual gods, but they are general action-expressing names that refer to the many actions or features or attributes that are associated with one single object, that is the one supreme Lord. Okay, that was there, and now let's turn to the other 19th century scholar that we're going to talk about, and then it's Friedrich Max Müller. Now, Max Müller, it's particularly well known because of his trademark theory, which it's summarized in the term nomina numina theory. Now, that is nomina numina, of course, Latin meaning like names, God theory. Now, in a nutshell, the theory works as follows. So Müller argues that myths and polytheism originated from a language error. They are what he calls a disease of language. And this disease of language can be cured by means of etymology. Now, let's consider the favorite example given by Müller. It is the word of the ancient Greek god Zeus, the main god of the ancient Greek pantheon. Now, he says, actually, if you look at Zeus etymologically, that is, if you compare the ancient Greek word Zeus with other words, cognate words in other Indo-European languages, for example, with the ancient Sanskrit dialos, meaning bride, we find out that originally Zeus was not a specific name denoting a specific god, but instead was an epithet, meaning the bright one, which was applicable to the daytime sky. Okay? So it's only over time that people forgot about this original etymologically clear meaning of Zeus referring to the sky, and they forgot about that. And the name itself, it is as if it took a divine form of entity, and therefore it was misunderstood as a god, whereas it just was an epithet describing a natural phenomenon. So this is, in a nutshell, like Müller's nomina numina idea, how from an error of language, myth and polytheism emerge. Now, the genealogy, that is, the ideas that went into the combining to forming Müller's ideas, is complex. However, I think an important source that most likely contributed to shaping Müller's theory is the South Asian tradition of etymology. Now, like Dayananda, Müller explains etymologically the names of individual gods mentioned in the Vedas as action expressing general names or epithet. However, Dayananda takes this epithet as characterizing various aspects of the one supreme Lord, whereas Müller explained these names as referring to various aspects of the natural phenomenon. So the final interpretation is different. So all these names, for Dayananda, they actually refer to different aspects of attributes of the one supreme Lord. Instead, for Müller, all these names, they originally refer to different aspects of the natural world. However, the mode of interpretation based on etymology is basically the same. And this goes all the way back to this South Asian tradition of etymology that we know that Müller was very familiar with. He was introduced to it when he was like a young scholar spending time in Paris by one of his teachers there. Okay, so now I just would like to kind of briefly summarize some of the ideas that I tried to share with you today. Now, we have considered today what I call the South Asian tradition of etymology. And I tried to show that this tradition played an important role in the intellectual and religious history of South Asia, as well as in other cultures that were influenced by South Asian cultures. And I tried to make this point by looking at 3 vignettes. Now, first, we explore etymology's role in the ancient Brahmanical or Hindu texts. And we saw that etymology was, at its origin, man's attempt to retrieve the original transparent names made opaque by God's linguistic intervention. We also saw that etymology was employed by early Indian philosophers as a tool for thinking to develop their own ideas. We then also saw in the Nirukta, this foundational text of the discipline of etymology in ancient India, that etymology is used for scientific investigation into language as well as into issues bearing on philosophy of language. Then, the second vignette was about Buddhism, and we saw how the Buddha of the Pali Theravada tradition uses etymology as a tool, as an argumentative tool to attack and subvert the Brahmanical ideology. We then moved over to China and we saw how the South Asian tradition of etymology is used by Chinese translators and interpreters to make sense of these Indian words. So it functions as a kind of cross-linguistic translation aiding tool. We then finally look at our third and last example, which is this 19th century religious discourse, and we look at these two seemingly opposite figures. We have the Axel professor, Friedrich Max Müller, and we have this traditional Hindu Brahmin, Dayananda Sarasvati, who hated each other. But even though they didn't get along, they, however, seem to have absorbed and developed ideas stemming from this common tradition of the South Asian tradition of etymology. We saw that Dayananda uses etymology to argue that the Vedas refer to the one supreme Lord and contain all forms of knowledge. This idea is very widespread as well in India nowadays. Like a default idea that I think many Indians have about the Vedas is actually that they are about a form of monotheism, as well as they contain many references to extremely advanced technical knowledge. And these ideas ultimately stem from Dayananda Saraswati, and he managed to put it across by referring to this etymological analysis. We then saw that Max Muller uses these ideas eventually derived from this tradition of etymology to argue for his nomina-numina theory, that is, polytheism of gods are a disease of language, which originated when the etymologic transpired name was forgotten, became opaque. Now, nowadays I think very few scholars, if any at all, in the field of religious studies would agree with Max Muller ideas. However, Max Muller, as the founding father of the discipline of etymology, was an extremely influential figure, and these ideas about name of gods being actually epithet referring to different aspects of the natural world was one of the first dominant paradigms in the modern study of religion. A dominant paradigm that gets some idea, interestingly, from a very, very old South Asian tradition of thought. So, what I hope in this talk is to have given you a sense of how pervasive, how rich, and also hopefully how interesting this South Asian tradition of etymology is, and how through many incarnations, many languages including Sanskrit, Pali, Chinese and English, this tradition has contributed to generating and shaping the ideas that inspired and drove innumerable people in South Asia and elsewhere over more than 3,000 years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going back to you.